Live, a show for pool chemistry enthusiasts where we talk about all the coolest chemistry stuff you never knew you wanted to know. Any chemical advice or suggestions are opinion and utilized at the discretion of each individual pool operator. With that out of the way, let's start the show. We'll go.
We're ready? Okay,
Yeah.
We're ready.
Perfect timing.
Oh, this is not scripted. Can you tell?
We're live.
We're live. Welcome to episode 2 of season 3 of The Real Scoop Live. Today, as you can see on the screen, we are talking about testing interference when the results just aren't right. And as usual, it is the illustrious Brett and the
Magnanimous
with us today to talk about this phenomenon. So take it away, guys.
Anytime I hear the word phenomenon, I just think about that Muppet song.
Phenomena. Yeah.
All right. Off to a good start.
Yep. All business here. That's for sure. That's for
right.
Sure. Welcome to all the subscribers to RSL. We appreciate you being here and anyone that joined us live. And if you didn't join us live, thank you for watching whenever you're watching. So today is, it doesn't really matter what today is. It's July 2023. And we are going to talk about testing interferences. And this has come up increasingly
frequently,
much more this year than before. And I think that there's a lot of, like we talked about in the last episode, there's a lot of ecological things that are going on that everyone thinks is creating testing interference. And in some cases it is, but there's also interferences that would happen last year, 2 years, or in a year from now, or even today. So we wanted to talk about those and what to look for as you're doing water samples, not only if you're a service company, but also if you're working in a retail store, if you're doing someone else's water test, or even if you're doing your own. All this stuff is important to know and to understand, especially when you're fighting a pool that's not responding for some reason. So
a lot of this stuff could have been happening all along, and you may just not have realized it. So keep an open mind when going into this, because some of this stuff may blow your hair back.
If you have hair. It didn't blow my hair back.
Was it more evolved people lose their hair?
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, because you don't need it, right?
No, just gets in the way. Okay, so today we're going to start off with pH, and really this is something that you're going to see. What we're going through with our schedule on this is we're going to go right through the typical test that you do when you do a water sample, whether it's a drop test, a spin lab, or whatever other kind that you're doing, a test strip. These are all things to consider. So we're going to start with pH because that's the one that most people recognize and know that how the importance of pH is to the balance of the water and the feel of the water. So Brett, I mean, one of the big things, and we've been dealing with this a lot, is the bleaching out of reagents.
Yep. So if you think about chlorine, bleach, same chemicals, the same thing it's doing to your yellow underarms on your white t-shirts when you're bleaching your wash, it's doing to the color of the reagents when you're testing it's a gross example, but they'll remember it. You got butter pits. If you want to take care of butter pits, use some bleach. So that same thing is happening with your test reagents. So if your chlorine is high enough, it's actually bleaching the color out of the reagent. Now, that may not seem like that big a deal, but it is, because you're comparing it to a different color, typically on a comparator, or if you're using a digital one, it's using a record of what a color is to compare it against. So if the colors are bleached out because your chlorine or bromine are too high, you're getting inaccurate results and you cannot trust them. So it can be in as little as 10 parts per million of chlorine. And having taken quite a few tech calls this week where people had chlorine levels that were about 4 times higher than that, most of the readings that they were testing probably couldn't be trusted just because of that factor there of the bleaching out of the reagents that you're testing your water with. Another one is hot water. Hot water can interfere with how your results show off, specifically for chlorine. So if you're thinking about your customers that come into your retail stores, or if you're testing a sample in a pool that's 100 degrees, or people have left their water sample in the car all day and it's ripping hot when you pour it into the tester to test it, that one may not be the best one to test off of, because the high heat and the high temperature can actually cause interference and show wrong readings as well. So we'll actually talk more about temperature on a further slide down, but just know that that can affect this one as well.
So there's two more parts to that too before we go on to the next one, and that is when you have a water sample that's rip roaring hot, you may be, and most likely will be, having the chlorine burnout as well. And so if something was really hot, even if it came down to room temperature, it may register that the chlorine is 0 when really it could be 3, 5, or 10. We just don't really know. And the other part of the high chlorine is that if you're doing a spin lab, and this is something that's important to know, and I think that that this is probably the best place to put this part, is that the spin lab does not get bleached out, but it only registers up to 15 parts per million, right around there. And so what happens essentially is that you could do a spin disc test and have a chlorine reading of 15, but it can only read the reagent up to 15. So it may be that the actual chlorine is 20, or it could be 30, or it could be 50. You just don't know because it can't register past 15. So that's something to consider, especially in light of a couple of cases that we've been working on for the last 2 or 3 weeks, in that you keep getting a 15, 16 part per million of chlorine, but yet you're putting in loads and loads of thiosulfate, which is chlorine neutralizer, and you're still getting a reading of 15. And you may think, well, the thiosulfate's not working, but the chlorine might have been 60. We just don't really know what people are doing in their pools, because when you're dealing with the public, sometimes they tell you what they think you want to hear, right?
There it is.
And so, yeah, I know you get it. I'm running interference today, so so that's just something to consider.
Nobody likes to be called out when they're doing something wrong. So a lot of times they'll just tell you what they think you want to hear so that you don't call them out, and they're doing themselves a disservice. There's not a lot of people are going to judge you because something wrong is going on in your pool. Ultimately, most people just want to help to prevent it or to get rid of the issue. So don't be nervous about sharing the issues you have going on with your pool, because if you do have problems, you're probably not going to get them fixed unless you share what's going on.
Right.
The next one, and this kind of bleeds into a lot of the other ones as well. High levels of sanitizer like chlorine and bromine can cause any manner of tests to show incorrectly. Just like we mentioned before, it can bleach out the reagents. Now, if you're using a liquid test kit that has liquid reagents and you're dropping it into a test comparator, you'll see these a lot of times, commonly on pool decks. In chlorine levels as low as 10 parts per million, that can start to have an effect on the reagents. Now, on the powdered reagent test kits, and that Matt already mentioned one of them, the spin discs or spin labs, they're a little bit more stable. The powdered reagent is, but they can still have interference at about 15 parts per million. And so if you think about what Matt was talking about, where if you get 15 parts per million, but you're actually at 50, but it can only show 15, think about the level of interference that could be happening on that. I mean, we've had people that when they tested their water, it said they had a total alkalinity of 0. It's next to impossible to have alkalinity at 0. You're usually going to have some. Calcium, it's next to impossible to have a calcium of 0 unless you've gone to extreme lengths to get calcium out of your water. And it's so expensive.
Water's clear. The water's clear, Brett.
So's acid. I don't want to swim in acid.
Nope.
So there's a little variation between test kits and what types you use. So test strips, test labs, electronic testers, comparators that you hold up to the sun. It's going to have a similar theme moving through what we're talking about here with what can interfere with it, but just based on the stoutness of the test, the different variations of the reagents that they have, you might have a couple things that are specific to the test that you use. So depending on what you use as your primary go-to to test stuff, make sure you read the troubleshooting section at the back, because a lot of times in the manual, it will list out the common interferences of what you could be dealing with. So it lets you be more effective out on the field or at your retail store to tell people the right information. Matt, you want to talk about the last bullet point there?
Yeah, there's two things I want to bring up. Number one, we're talking about liquid reagents and we're talking about powder reagents. So depending on what brand that you use, whether you're using the drop test or whether you're using, a Spin Lab or the little scoop, the DVD scoops or whatever, that's all fine and good. But there are people that are using test strips, and basically the rule of thumb would be, whether you know what the interferences are or not, or if you can even find the manual, or maybe the manual got wet, is that if you're getting colors as a result that are not on the color scale, you know that something is wrong. And so odds are that wrong, or the cause of those colors being messed up, is that you have a high chlorine. So there's lots of different ways. I mean, you can kind of figure it out. You can look at the interferences. You can put it into a search engine and see what exactly the cause is. But basically, if it's not on the comparator scale of color, you know that typically it's either going to be super high in chlorine, which is what it probably is, or something else is way off. Because the other thing too, and what we didn't consider on this page, is that you can have reagents that are old, because remember that they have a shelf life. And so if you have not rotated stock, or maybe wherever you bought it from didn't rotate stock, you might be using reagents that are old, or test strips that are old, or someone that has a holdover from September and they close their pool and they open it in April or May and they want to use the same test strips, but the test strips went bad in November. Well, they're not really going to give you an accurate test. Now,
or you let it freeze in your truck over the winter.
That's true. Or heaven forbid, you have a test strip little case that you get water in.
Yeah.
Because that will ruin everything. So you might as well just throw them away if you get them wet. Now, here's one way. This is an old school way back from the dreaded 90s that you can tell whether your chlorine is super high.
They're coming back.
And it may not be that you even have access to this stuff, but there used to be a 2-bottle kit that was very cheap, that was chlorine or OTO along with pH, which is phenol red. And it was 2 little bottles, and typically you could buy that whole kit for $3 at the time, or you could buy a replacement reagent for about 79 cents. So the OTO, which really isn't as available nowadays, if you have your hands on one of those, the way to test if you have a super high chlorine is literally to put 3 milliliters of water in a little comparator, and then put 1 drop of OTO in there and move it around a little bit. If that water turns, I'm not going to use what I normally say, golden, then that means the chlorine is super high. And if that's the case, then that means that water test is not a viable water test, and you need to try again. So if you're at the pool, that means that don't test it this week, because you can't give accurate results. You don't want to tell a pool owner, oh, well, your pH and well, that was weird.
He's back though.
Yeah. But so that's the kind of thing you have to make sure, if you think you're getting all messed up and you want to check to make sure it's high chlorine, well, that's the way to do it. So carry a little OTO with you, either in your pocket or in your truck, or if you have it on a water test sink, you can have it underneath the, where all the other bottles are, the stuff that you don't really test. So let's go on to alkalinity. We have talked about all these different things, all these different parameters in and out on different episodes. So if you want to know more about any of this stuff, I suggest that you look at our page at youtube.com/RealScoopLive, and that way you can see all kinds of different stuff that we've talked about. But basically, when you have interferences with alkalinity, the alkalinity typically, when you do the drop test, is going to be a different color, i.e. typically purple. Depending on how bad it is, it can also be yellow. And so, if you have any kind of, not green or red, then you know that you have an issue with something. Typically with high chlorine, it would be a bleached out version of that, right? So you can have typically yellow or actually, I think that the calcium is blue and the alkalinity is yellow instead of green and purple, if that's right. Something along those lines. Anyway, high levels of chlorine or bromine can bleach out the reagents and giving false readings. If you have a 0, like Brett said earlier, I mean, odds are you're not going to have an alkalinity of 0 unless someone has really gone crazy on the acid, or maybe put in too much acid or mistook acid for shock or something like that. But there's also, and this is not an interference typically unless you're trying to figure out the Langmuir's index and other things like that, which is adjusted alkalinity or carbonic alkalinity. So Brett, when you tell us about that.
So if you have high levels of cyanuric acid in your water, that will actually give you a false high reading of total alkalinity. So there's actually a formula that you can use to find the adjusted alkalinity, which subtracts that cyanuric acid interference. The quick and dirty version, there's more precise ones, but the quick and dirty one is take your cyanuric acid level and divide it by 3. And whatever you get there, you subtract from the tested total alkalinity reading. So that's confusing as all get out. So your total alkalinity tested at, let's say, 150. Your cyanuric acid was at 90. So 90 divided by 3 gives you 30, right? So you take the 30 and then subtract that from the tested total alkalinity and you get 120. So you're on the high end of where you want to be, but you're still technically okay. Read up more on that one. We've talked a bunch about adjusted alkalinity, but just keep in mind, if your if your cyanuric acid is way high, your alkalinity is probably testing higher than it actually is. That's the easiest way to remember it. And this really comes in when you've got particularly homeowners that I like to call them type A personalities, where they don't let things go, because generally we like to hang out within a certain range. And if it's not at that perfect ideal spot, they will fret about it and they will add stuff over and over and too frequently and too often until they turn their pool into chemical soup and then have real problems. Your pool needs time to actually incorporate when you're doing chemistry changes. And a lot of that has to do with the flow of the water. And we're going to talk about that on a later Real Scoop Live. It's not just chemistry. How the pool runs and how it functions and flows has a lot to play with that as well. So total alkalinity, we got that one. Remember, if your cyanuric acid is too high, you've got other problems, but it's also probably throwing off your alkalinity reading as well. Calcium and total.
Yeah, we kind of talked about this. I was hoping that we were going to go to cyanuric acid since you're talking about adjusted alkalinity. And but the thing about it is that when you're testing for calcium and or total hardness, what you need to consider is that the total hardness doesn't necessarily mean that that's all calcium. That's everything that causes hardness in the water. So you may not have a calcium reading of 300 when you have a total hardness reading of 300. Your calcium may be even less than that, because remember, calcium just likes to hook up with anything. And so there's calcium mixed with all kinds of different components or different I'm not going to say contaminants, but different things that are in the water. But then there's also other metals and minerals that would be considered hard.
Like
and so
magnesium.
Yes, all kinds of stuff. So calcium just typically is the main component of total hardness. So when you're doing a sample or when you're using a test kit, make sure that you know that if it says total hardness or total calcium, that it's testing the right thing. And remember, we were just talking about just a second ago, is that when you're doing a calcium test, typically I think it goes either purple or blue, and if the calcium or the chlorine is high, then it goes pink. And so if it's something not on the comparator color chart, then you know that the chlorine is really high. And you're probably going to know it from other parameters before you even get to this one. But there's really no sense in continuing the test if you know that the chlorine is super high and wreaking havoc with the reagents.
And if you've got
the water was super hot.
If you've got high stray metals in your test sample, that can actually throw off your calcium or total hardness readings as well. So if you're in a taking care of a pool that's on a well water, it's got iron, copper, any number of metals in there, that can actually throw off the readings that you get when you test it.
Yeah.
Here's your cyanuric acid.
Oh, I love it. I love it. We could actually do a whole thing about this. So here's the thing about cyanuric acid that Brett alluded to before. When you're doing a water sample, typically whether you're doing the drop test or the plunger one with the black dot, or even a test strip, there are certain tests that can go past 100, but not a lot of them, and typically they're not used a lot in the industry. So what happens essentially is, especially on the plunger test, is that when you get to 100, If you go past that, every pencil line is another 100. And so what you're looking at essentially is that when it goes past 100, it's not 115 or 120. It's not something that you guess. It's literally 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 600. And believe it or not, that happens. And so when you have people that are mistakenly using dichlor as a shock, or as an oxidizer, or as, you know, as their mode of sanitation, you know, not that we're anti-dichlor here, but dichlor does have 3 times more cyanuric acid than trichlor, which is the tablet. So if people are using dichlor as a shock because they're buying it at a big box store instead of using Cal Hypo or liquid chlorine, they're literally adding way more cyanuric acid than they should. And so if you want to have between 15 and 60, and you're running at 100 or even higher, like I took a call this week where the store was telling me that, well, this person's pool was measuring at 180 cyanuric acid, and they drained half of it and it went down to 140. And I said, well, that's still too high. Well, yeah, it's better than 180. Well, that's true.
But still not where you want to be.
Still needs to be about half of that, if not less, right? And that really comes down to the 15 to 60 comes down to who you ask. So without trying to be confusing, you need to know that right at 55 parts per million, anything above that actually becomes more detrimental to the kill rate of the chlorine. So the higher the cyanuric acid goes, the less effective the chlorine is. And so you may not think that that's a big deal, but if you're trying to get rid of combined chlorine and using the right amount of shock to reach breakpoint chlorination,
it becomes a big deal.
You need to consider that that's a big deal. And then also for interferences, because we were just talking about it, if you have a cyanuric acid that you think is 100, but it's actually 300, and you're using that same formula that Brett said about a third of your stabilizer actually gives you a false reading of alkalinity. If you're at 100, well, then you're talking about 33. A third is 33 of 100. But if you're at 300, it's 100. Right? So in the same instance as, or example, as Brett was saying, at 150 alkalinity, but you have a 300 stabilizer, your alkalinity, your actual alkalinity is only 50. And so 50 doesn't keep pH where it's supposed to be. So that's why you see some pH drift back and forth. All right, did I kill that? I probably talked too much about it, but you know, this kind of stuff is really exciting for geeks like us.
So the one thing left on cyanuric acid that we really want to drive home,
Top
temperature. So you know, we said don't bring in really hot or really cold samples. Directly impacts how your cyanuric acid test reads. So if you've got water that's over 85 degrees, it will show a false low cyanuric acid. So think about that. We're in the dog days of summer. Matt said it's going to be 100 degrees where he is for the next 10 days. Your water's pretty hot, which means you have a false low cyanuric acid, which means if you're already testing at 100 parts per million, you're well over 100 parts per million. So when the temperature comes down to a reasonable level, if you test it at a room temperature, holy bejesus, my cyanuric acid went from 100 to 150 in 2 weeks. What happened? It was always at 150. You're just testing it more accurately now. The inverse is true as well. So if you're under 65 degrees, it will show a false high cyanuric acid. So you're getting your pool started at the kickoff of the season. If you're an area that actually winterizes and closes pools where the temperature actually does get low, if you do your initial test and you're seeing 70 parts per million of cyanuric acid and you're testing in the water at 50 degrees, you might let it come up to room temperature and test it again to get a more accurate gauge, because you may not need to dump as much water as you think you do, if you need to dump any at all. Test strips, pHs of higher than 8 or lower than 7 will give you weird results, and they can't really be trusted either. So maintain your normal balance where it needs to be and your temperature at about room temperature when testing to get accurate tests on cyanuric acid.
I think one of the aspects of what you're talking about just right there is that if you have, for some reason, water that's above 85 degrees, like if you're from Central Texas where it's 106 every day, or in the desert, if you do a sample and a cyanuric acid level is at 0, but we know that the water above 85 is giving you a false low reading, well, maybe you shouldn't put in any cyanuric acid. Maybe check to see how long the chlorine lasts, especially if you're using liquid chlorine or Cal Hypo. And if it's the normal amount, well, then that probably means you don't need any cyanuric acid. So you don't have to guess, right? Because you can't get rid of cyanuric acid despite what, I mean, you can with certain products, but there's a lot of hoops to jump through to get them to work as well as they need to.
Testing isn't just reading reading a
Yeah.
printout. It takes contextual clues and a little bit of critical thinking, because there's common sense in here. But if you haven't had to deal with this before, I mean, people who just got into a retail store, or people who just started doing pool stuff, if they're looking at a printout, those are under ideal situations. So if you're reading this and it just says add this, this, and this, that's in a sterile bubble of an environment. There's nothing else going on. There's no, the computer doesn't have the ability at this point in time to consider all the other goofy stuff. That's where the human interaction comes in. That's why a lot of times you'll see at retail shops, the people doing the water test will go through line by line and maybe make notes and say, hey, it's calling for this. Don't do that. Add half of this. Do this. Do that. And they're actually tweaking a little bit based off of what they know actually happens in their markets. So the printouts or the test results are a good baseline or jumping off point, but they do require a little bit of critical thinking before you can actually get to the point of being a pool miracle worker, I think.
Yeah.
TDS and salt. This one's a quick one, so I'm going to go through it fast. When you put salt in the water, it increases the TDS. So your TDS is going to be artificially high in every saltwater pool. What's a common level of salt in a pool, Matt?
3,000.
Okay. So what do you think your TDS will go up by?
Well, it's going to probably go up to 3,000.
Hey, look at that.
3,000. So, and the other point of this too is that TDS is going to be different in areas that are experiencing drought. It's going to be in different areas that are experiencing very hot temperatures. I know for a fact that around Lake Havasu that there is about 9 feet of evaporation per season. And so if you have a 6-foot pool, you're pretty much filling your pool 1.5 times, but yet you're not getting rid of any of the dissolved solids. And so when you're testing and you see a high dissolved solid reading and you might think, oh no, I need to drain some water out, make sure to test the salt too, and then minus the salt from the TDS, and the difference is what you need to worry about. So the other part of that too is that calcium is a dissolved solid. So if you want to take the calcium out, take the salt out, and then whatever's left over is the stuff you have to worry about. So typically if it's 2,500 parts per million higher than whatever your source water is, that's when we need to worry about it. So just take all those things into consideration.
Beating a dead horse here, temperature, high or low, can have an effect on a bunch of different water tests. So let it get to room temperature. What we would consider that between 70 and 80 degrees, kind of a nice vanilla.
70 to 80, and then 7.0 to 8.0 on the pH. And if you want to get even better, I mean 7.2 to 7.6, 7.8 around in there.
Yep.
That gives you the most accurate test.
And this is the one that we're kind of excited to talk about a little bit. Matt, I'm going to let you jump on this one because you were pretty animated when we were talking about it earlier.
Okay, so and the funny thing is we had a discussion about this particular episode being one of the shorter ones, and here we are at the 28-minute mark. So I will kind of go through this fast. Here's the thing. When we talk about combined chlorine before, we talked about breakpoint chlorination before, and how getting rid of combined chlorine has to do with breakpoint chlorination, but there's so many other factors that you have to consider in order to get enough chlorine in there, enough effective chlorine in there into the pool at the right time to literally gas off that combined chlorine. And so typically if you haven't watched some of the other episodes that we've done, breakpoint chlorination essentially is finding what your combined chlorine reading is, and then effectively putting in 10 times higher that amount of a part per million of chlorine. All that you need to have it all at once. The problem is if the pH is off low or high, if the cyanuric acid is high, if there's a high contaminant load in the water, then that formula doesn't really work. You have to get more and more and more. Now, there's another phenomenon that has to do with that, and this is kind of going down the rabbit hole, but it's very important because it's very apropos for this season right now, and that is chloramine breakthrough. When you talk about chloramine breakthrough, essentially what happens is in a water sample, when the combined chlorine gets to 2 parts per million or higher, and the higher past 2 parts per million, the more this has a chance of happening, is that you can actually have a free chlorine reading and a total chlorine reading read exactly the same because of the chloramines and what the chloramines do to the reagents. and that's called chloramine breakthrough. So there may be a time when you can smell chlorine in the water, or maybe people's eyes are hurting, or their skin is itchy and things like that, and you do a water sample and you have a free chlorine of 5 and a total chlorine of 5, but in reality the free chlorine is 1 and the total chlorine is 5, but the combined chlorine, since it's 4, which is above 2, actually makes the reagents read differently.
So
and when they read differently, they come together and are the same color.
To give a little context to what Matt's saying, combined chlorine is technically still an oxidizer.
Mhm.
And in certain instances, it is used as a sanitizer, as a combined chlorine or a chloramine.
Especially in metro water systems.
So if you do have a high enough level of combined chlorine or chloramines present in the water, it's throwing off the test result because it's oxidizing. It's doing what it's intended to do. But in a pool, it's not strong enough to do what we need it to do to keep the pool safe and clean and ready to run. So it could show you don't have any combined chlorine, but you could have a boatload, and the free chlorine that you have can't deal with the amount that's in there.
Right.
So you don't even know there's a problem, except there's problems in the pool. So when those people come in and say, I've got this going on with my pool, I've tried everything, or I've tried nothing, and I'm all out of ideas. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about here, because the test wouldn't show anything's wrong. Common sense wouldn't say anything's wrong based off of the test that you're dealing with. So this is where this kind of weird information that we get excited about comes into play, because we're trying to get this out there so other people know about it. You could have a pool that has problems, all the tests read perfect, and 90% of the calls that we get are, well, all of my tests are perfect, but you have problems. Okay, that doesn't happen all that often. When it does, it's kind of a really weird one that gets us excited to talk about it and troubleshoot. There's something awry, something's going wrong. So the best part about non-chlorine or chlorine-free shocks is there's no downside. You add them and they break down combined chlorine. You add them and they prevent the formation of combined chlorine. That's why we have a nice picture of OxySplash on our shameless plug down here in the corner, because it's a non-chlorine or chlorine-free shock. It breaks down chloramines. It prevents them from forming in the first place. Kind of a big deal, because if you don't have combined chlorine, the free chlorine that's in the water is working for you. It's getting it done. Sorry, I didn't
this
steamroll.
Episode, that's okay. This episode of Real Scoop Live is brought to you by OxySplash.
Yeah, there it is.
The best chlorine-free shock to get rid of and prevent chloramine breakthrough and combined chlorine issues, and reach breakpoint chlorination without having to use a ton of chlorine. Because the nice thing about OxySplash is that it doesn't change the water chemistry. You don't need to reach breakpoint chlorination. You can still swim while everything's happening. And it's only £1 per 20,000 gallons. That's a heck of a product. And we're glad that OxySplash is our sponsor. And if you notice the little shameless plug there in the bottom right, we appreciate that. So this one is a little bit longer. We always say this, but let's wrap it up, Brad.
That's right. So closing it out, if you've got a low battery in your tester, can throw false readings. Are you colorblind? That could affect how you read test results. Dirty comparators. I've seen this a lot with service guys that have used the same test blocks for years. You should clean them out every once in a while. And you know what? If they're really bad, throw them away and get a new one. You can't test if it's so foggy that you can't read, or the sun can't penetrate through it. Are they expired, like Matt mentioned earlier? Does the electronic gizmo that you're testing the water with have firmware updates? Do you have calibration discs that you have to do? Do you have to do it every so often? Read your manuals. That really has a big impact on what you're testing. How are your reagents held or added? If you hold the bottle cockeyed a little bit, you're putting in more reagent than you need. It's supposed to be straight up and down and vertical to have a controlled drop size. So if you go off to the side a little bit, it's actually giving you a different reading than what's going on in your water.
Makes it harder to read for sure.
Make sure if you're doing discs to test with those, fill the disc up to the proper amount. Don't shoot under, don't go over. It has an impact on how those things work. And the surprised lady here is trying to drive the point here. If you notice, if you keep your things more consistent, the longer you keep them consistent, the better it is for you, because a lot of different factors can throw off a lot of different tests. So if you can't even test and trust the test results that you're getting because so many things are out of whack on your pool, it's really hard to troubleshoot. And that's when it gets frustrating. And that's when pool professionals can potentially lose customers because they think you don't know what you're doing because you're getting wrong results based off of the weird stuff going on in their water because they let it get to that point. So,
or they didn't tell you everything that you need to know, or
yeah.
you didn't think to ask them, right?
So
So a lot of times that happens. And just to let you know, if you go this way and that way, the surprised lady's eyes really follow you, kind of like a haunted house painting.
oh, that's
It's
creepy.
really kind of weird. So let's go to the next screen.
The next screen. This is the next screen. That's it.
All right. We did it. Another successful Real Scoop Live is in the books. We really appreciate you guys tuning in and watching it whenever you watch it. If you would do us a favor, please like and share as much as you feel comfortable with. And we will be back in another week, and we're going to talk about something really cool.
That's right.
That's right. And I think it's going to be filtration and hydraulics. So that may not seem like something that you would talk about on a chemistry podcast, but we found this year that there's been multiple times when the water has been balanced and for some reason the water still doesn't look right. And so we thought that it was very important to talk about the different things to consider when you have water that doesn't seem to be responding even though it's balanced. So that's next week's episode here on the RSL channel on YouTube and everywhere else. So Stacey, take it away. Have a great weekend, everybody.
That's a wrap. We will see you next week, Friday. We go live at 10 a.m. Eastern time across Facebook and YouTube. And like Matt said, if you can't catch the live, you can catch the replay on both platforms and on our Spotify channel. Have a great and safe weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Nice. Is it still rolling?